Hi everybody and welcome to our latest public accountability meeting. Now I have a new face to introduce you to this evening, but before we start that, these meetings are a really important part of my police and crime plan, and particularly about strengthening the relationship between you, Surrey's residents, and Surrey Police, and we'll be coming on to that. I say it's one method because actually there are a number of ways in which you can engage with the work that my office does, but also the work of Surrey Police. And you can go to our website to see the data hub in particular, which will show you all of the information and all the various ways in which I hold the Chief Constable to account. Now, in terms of today, we have had a good number of questions in already, which is brilliant, and we're going to try to get to as many of those as possible. You can also put your questions in the comment box, and again, we will try to get to as many of them as possible. I'm sorry if we can't get to all of the questions, but hopefully we can answer and come back to you with all of the answers. Now, it is an enormous pleasure to introduce you to our new Chief Constable. Tim Meyer is Tim's first public accountability meeting, and we're going to start cracking on with the questions. But Tim, first of all, could you tell us a little bit about your early reflections, a bit about your background, and I suppose what your early thoughts are on being in Surrey Police?
Yeah, certainly. So I've been in the police for 25 years, some of that in the Metropolitan Police, the last 14 or so in Thames Valley, and most of the early years as a detective, and then lately in charge of the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, neighbourhood policing in the Thames Valley, professional standards, and then investigation. And then my last significant responsibility in the Thames Valley was to be the Gold Commander for London Bridge, which was the arrangements for the Queen's funeral. And I've been here now for 6 weeks or so as the Chief of Surrey, which really is an absolute privilege for me. Surrey's a force I've long admired. It's well respected across UK policing, particularly in respect of its investigative capability and its formidable track record in preventing crime. So it's a force I've long wanted to work in, and it's a real privilege to be here. I've tried to get out and about as much as I possibly can in my first few weeks, and I found largely what I expected to find in a force of Surrey standing. First of all, which is officers and staff who are really, really competent. They know their stuff. They're conscientious, they're committed to serving the people of Surrey, but I think it can be even better than it is in three critical respects. Firstly, in tackling violence against women and girls. In respect of domestic abuse, I know that we can respond more quickly, we can investigate cases more thoroughly, we can make more arrests, and I think we can bring more offenders to justice. And in rape and sexual offences, I know that we can do better in keeping victims and survivors of sexual abuse on board with our investigations right through to court cases. And while Surrey is superb at preventing crime and at dealing with many lower level offences, I think we can do much better in catching the more serious criminals in cases such as sexual offences, domestic abuse, burglary and organised crime. And I and my senior team share an ambition for us to charge many more offenders. And finally, our productivity. It's really important, of course, that we answer the phone quickly, that we get to people in need quickly, and that we do the things which only the police can do really well. And it's a challenge for us to do that when so much of our time increasingly is taken up, for example, with people in mental health crisis, which, though really important, is not necessarily the thing that only the police can do. So I want to find ways of working better with our partners to alleviate some of that or address some of that need and free up the police to get on with fighting crime and protecting people.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's great. We're also joined this evening, as you'll be able to see, by Deputy Chief Constable Nev Kemp and by my deputy, the Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner Ellie Vasey-Thompson, and we'll be hearing from them a bit later as well. Now, as many of you will already know, one of the key responsibilities of Police and Crime Commissioner is to produce a police and crime plan. And taking up office on 2021, we went out to an enormous amount of stakeholders, including the Surrey public themselves, to ask them what you wanted to see in the plan. And so, as a reminder, the 5 high-level priorities within the plan are reducing violence against women and girls, protecting people from harm in Surrey, working with Surrey community so they feel safe, strengthening relationships between Surrey Police and Surrey residents, and ensuring safer Surrey roads. Normally this part of the meeting we'd look at the police performance in each of those priorities to understand the progress and the potential challenges, but it would be interesting, given that this is your first meeting, and before I move on to questions, just to give your initial views of those priorities within the police crime plan. You've talked briefly already about reducing violence against women and girls, and that will be the first area we look at, but I'd be really interested in your reflections on those priorities.
Certainly. So perhaps if I deal with violence against women and girls first of all, and this is an area of great interest to me. It certainly was in the Thames Valley, and I think it's worth taking a step back from the operational obligations of the police and really thinking about the strong moral case that there is for us to do much better in respect of violence against women and girls. If you think for a moment about the sorts of cases which feature here, domestic abuse, rape and sexual offences, the victims and survivors of those cases are victims really in the course of their ordinary life. They meet a partner, they move in with them, they go to work, they go out for the night, and to my mind that creates a very strong obligation on the part of police and partners to do something about those offences, because it seems to me that the women who are victims are really victims in the course of ordinary life simply because they are women, and there are some really challenging legal and operational things to overcome as well, but I'm determined that we do. In respect of domestic abuse, we can certainly respond faster than we are at the moment. A report of domestic abuse presents a vanishingly brief opportunity to do something for that victim and about that perpetrator. We know that survivors of domestic abuse might well have been assaulted over 30 times or perhaps over 3 years before the matter comes to our attention. So it's vital that officers seize that opportunity to do something about that case. That's really important, because we know the cardinal feature of violence against women and girls is that if we don't do something about it, there will be a next time. So it's really important that we seize that opportunity. And then in respect of rape and sexual offences, Surrey is certainly doing better than it was a couple of years ago. We're solving more cases of rape and sexual offences than we were, but absolutely critical to that are two things. Firstly, it's the ability to encourage reporting and to engage with victims, because where we can keep the engagement of the victim, we get the evidence that we need to bring the case to trial. And then secondly, we need a really good relationship with the Crown Prosecution Service, because it's on their authority that we bring those proceedings to trial. And I suppose there is a third, which is that I want to see us really focus much more on investigating suspects as much as we do victims, and that means looking at people who've been reported many times on suspicion of this sort of activity and joining the cases up and doing all that we possibly can in that respect. Something I'm keen to bring across from Thames Valley, and Surrey already has plans in this area, is an operation known as Operation Vigilant, where specially trained, highly vetted officers run a covert plainclothes operations as our nighttime economy to spot people who are skulking about, acting suspiciously with no good reason for being out and about on Friday and Saturday nights, other than to pose a risk to women who are out. And I want to make sure that we do rather better in that respect. And then finally, in respect of stalking, Surrey already has some good plans in this area. Surrey does really well in respect of making use of prevention orders to tackle stalkers. I'm keen we make better use of that, but we also need to get rather better at simply bringing those offenders to justice too. So those are the sorts of areas I hope that we can focus on. But I need to be absolutely clear, I'm determined to focus on this, but it's not new to Surrey. Surrey has already given an awful lot of thought in this area under very capable leadership, and there's an awful lot that we can build on already.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Tim. And you've already touched on this with Operation Vigilant, but we know that women's perception of safety after dark is something the force monitors incredibly closely, particularly with the joint neighbourhood survey that many of you will be aware of and have participated in, and that really acts as the basis of our data here in Surrey. As well as bringing up Vigilant in, which would be absolutely fantastic, could you set out some of the work that's being undertaken by the force to provide that reassurance to our communities, whether that is patrols, working with the third sector, or identifying particular problem areas as well?
Yeah, so first of all, the force already has good operations in respect of making sure there's high visibility in the areas of greatest risk, and notably our nighttime economy. One of the things which really impressed me when preparing to compete for the role of Chief Constable here is the excellent relationship that Surrey Police has with the victims sector in ensuring that we've got proper provision for victims and survivors of domestic abuse, and understanding well that for the victim there is a life outside the abuse, and it's very difficult for a victim simply to turn her life upside down in order to pursue a criminal prosecution, and therefore the more that we can do in respect of providing exemplary victim care from 101 right through to the witness box, the better. So insofar as I can tell on my first impressions, it's about the high visibility operations in the area of greatest need, but it's also about making sure that we're getting the absolute right care and support for the victim at the point of reporting right the way through to court. And we know that we've got some really good initiatives funded through the Office of the Policing and Crime Commissioner to make sure that we do that well. And it might be that I haven't done that justice. I don't know if you want to come in with any other points that you can think of, or if that's
just the only point I'd add is an operational example, I think, of where we have taken very seriously the concerns of women and the potential dangers which were occurring along the canal in Woking, and there were some reports there of a man indecently exposing himself, and we put tremendous effort into identifying who that person was, but also making sure that women could use the canal at all times of day and during the darkness, and be safe and feel safe. And I'm delighted to say Surrey's won a national award for that, called the Tilly Award, and the team that worked on that have also been nominated for an international award. So I think that demonstrates how determined we are to tackle that sort of behaviour and have a county that is safe but also feels safe for women.
Yeah.
And just on that point, if I may, we're really trying to get across this idea that we serve victims tirelessly, and what that means, in my mind, is that we serve the victim to a standard we would expect if it were one of our own loved ones who were the victim. And that means really, really good victim care. It means the officer has their body-worn video on, that they carry out a thorough investigation, that we make arrests as soon as we have grounds to suspect that someone is implicated in the offence, that we provide much better updates to the victim in the course of the investigation. We know that's something we need to get better at. But it's encouraging to see the early data which suggests that victims of these types of terrible crimes do generally feel they're well treated by officers. And I hope that emboldens people to report cases when they are victims. But we do need to get better at making sure that our care is absolutely exemplary in all occasions.
And just sort of, I suppose, focusing for a second on domestic abuse, and we know that Surrey's domestic abuse solved outcomes actually compare very favourably nationally. We're in a really good position on that, which is good. Could you provide an overview of any particular improvements that you'd want to see in the force's response to domestic abuse, recognising that maintaining the confidence and the support of victims is absolutely vital if we are going to get a successful prosecution at the end of it?
Certainly. So I think there are about 4 elements in the cycle, or the, if you will, the production of justice of domestic abuse. First of all, and very simply, you've got to answer the phone and you've got to respond quickly. That's really important, that we get on with what only the police can do. And there's lots of work that we're doing in respect to trying to improve our 999 and 101 call handling performance, but we've got to get there quickly. And there's some good work going on at the moment with Surrey's public protection team and partners to think about how can we not only respond faster, but also how can we respond in a way which meets the needs and wishes of that vulnerable victim. And I hope to be able to reveal more of those thoughts as we develop them. So that's the first thing. The next thing is, when we get there, our investigation has to be absolutely exemplary, and we have to make arrests. It's really important that we have the confidence to make arrests. It might well be that a survivor of domestic abuse says that they don't want any action taken against the suspect. And I can understand why that might be. There might be financial dependence. It might be that he is the father of their children. There could be any number of other reasons why they don't want to do that. But it's really important that we act not only to support that victim in that situation, but also to protect future victims, and that wherever possible we use our powers confidently and make arrests. So I want to see arrests go up. And then thirdly, we need to ensure that we are submitting cases to the Crown Prosecution Service which are really thorough. And that means good investigations, which make inquiries of neighbours, which make use of body-worn video, which shows the victim when they're at their most distressed, when officers first appear, and that we use all of our protective powers which government have given us in the form of legislation to keep that victim safe. And then finally, we work with the CPS to do everything we possibly can where appropriate to secure the conviction at court, accepting there has to be fairness for all, of course. Those are the sorts of areas I want to see us really improving on, and I think we can do so quickly.
Great, thank you, Tim. I've got one more question in this area, and you've actually covered an awful lot of it, but I do think it's worth us recognising that we're approaching 6 years since Me Too, and sadly 3 years since the horrific murder, obviously, of Sarah Everard at the hands of a Metropolitan Police officer. How do you think that policing has responded to this, and is there anything else that you would like to see policing do in order to rebuild that confidence, particularly with women?
So, in respect of sexual offences specifically, well in advance of the trial and the revelations about the awful cases to which you refer, policing was working very hard with the Crown Prosecution Service in respect of how we could do much better in this area. And we've seen Operation Soteria launch nationally, which examines how it is that police can take a much more suspect-focused approach to investigation, one which understands that victims of rape and sexual offences are targeted precisely because they are vulnerable to this type of offending, and how it is that we can really look at the suspects in these cases and understand their motivation and how it is that they target vulnerable people. We've responded by getting much better at dealing with digital evidence, because we know that so often in these cases inquiries need to be carried out in respect of victim or offender mobile phones, but for a victim who's been attacked in these circumstances, the last thing that she wants to do is to give up her mobile phone for months on end when that contains so much of her valuable data. And we've got much better at getting the information that we need quickly, only the information which is germane to the inquiry, and not intruding unnecessarily on a victim's privacy. That's really important area of work where we have where we've developed, and we've certainly got a lot better, I think, at working with the Crown Prosecution Service and more audaciously bringing cases to court, even where it might be evidence of only one party against the other. So we're definitely doing that rather better. And we've heard some of the other initiatives, whether it's vigilant or other things. Naturally, the public will be very interested in what it is that we're doing to make sure that the behaviour of our own officers, particularly our male officers, is exemplary in this respect. And certainly Nev and I will be abundantly clear that we expect male colleagues not to be bystanders to poor behaviour, but positively be upstanders for women and women's rights, and to stand up in every possible instance against the hatred and contempt and misogyny wherever we encounter that. And to that end, we're looking very closely at our vetting, our recruitment, and we will be having a real determined revisiting of the Code of Ethics with a keen focus on misogyny, and making sure that this force doesn't feature any of the terrible revelations which have been publicised elsewhere. So I think that's really important. And Nev and I have been discussing a lot how we want to have a really big effort in respect of violence against women and girls, and that means the relentless pursuit of perpetrators. It means safe public spaces, and it means being absolutely certain that our internal culture doesn't harbour anyone with that sort of who is in any way ill-disposed towards women.
Great, thank you. And having spent quite a lot of time with both of you, I can absolutely say, as a woman who lives in Surrey and wants to feel safe, and I'm sure Ellie would say the same, that your passion, the passion both of you bring to this, is incredibly reassuring, and I hope that the audience see that as well. Ellie, have you got any comments, questions for us?
A quick reminder to those watching online, as the Commissioner said at the beginning, please do pop questions in the Facebook comments if you have them. That's if you're watching live, and we'll do our best to get through all of the questions. We've not yet had any questions on violence against women and girls, but we have had a lovely comment from Elizabeth on Facebook. Elizabeth says, "Thank you for your work along the canal. I now feel happy to cycle along it, as I did today on my way to and from work. And I saw plenty of women walking along it on their own, which I hope is a sign of confidence."
That's lovely. Well, that will mean more to the team than almost anything. It's fantastic to hear.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's great. Excellent. Moving on to protecting people from harm in Surrey. So the priority is about recognising crime, but also the fear of crime, because as Nev's already said, we want people just to be safe in Surrey, but also, of course, to feel safe. And we know that that fear of crime can have a long-lasting and very detrimental effect on how people feel in their own homes and out and about on the streets. So we need police to do everything possible to protect children and adults from harm, and placing a really, really firm, I suppose, focus on the experiences of victims and how they feel, how they go about it, and also listen to voices and the feedback, and also that, as Tim, you've already mentioned, the services that we work with, which is really close. And I know that Ellie has already had some questions in about this, so
Have.
yes.
So we've had a few questions in already. The first one from William. William says, 50% of all crime in the UK is fraud or scamming. Can you state what % of resources Surrey Police dedicates to tackling it, and whether fraud is considered a key priority for the force?
So, in respect of resource allocation, first of all, it is, and I'm not being deliberately evasive, but it is difficult because of the way that crime happens and the way that policing responds to crime, to state precisely what percentage of resources dedicated to what crime type, because it might be that there is some pursuit of offenders to be done, it might be that there's some prevention to be done, it might be that there's some protection to be done, and it's difficult to explain precisely what percentage of policing is allocated to which offence and another. What I can say in respect of fraud, however, is that it is, by some estimates, 80% preventable.
Yeah.
So what we do in respect of prevention, whether working through our safer neighbourhood teams to ensure that vulnerable victims are not targeted repeatedly, is really important. What we can do to continue to educate the public in respect of their cyber security is really important, and I'm determined that we do that. We've got a very capable communications team here. I don't doubt will redouble their efforts in that respect. That's really important. Closely related to fraud is the question of criminal finance. And we know that the making of money is a really powerful motivator for criminals and organised crime groups. And I'm determined that we use the very strong powers at our disposal in respect of criminal finance and money laundering to seize and confiscate as much criminal cash as we possibly can. We're in the process with our senior team of working out how it is that this force will demonstrate its relentless pursuit of criminals. And I don't think there's anything more satisfying than taking the money off people who strip that out of communities. So I think that's a really important area of focus. The investigation of fraud, I must be straight, is complicated. It's not as straightforward as investigating violence or more typical crimes because of the digital and financial complexities. So I am going to have to consider how it is that we prioritise those cases where there are good lines of inquiry, where we can bring fraudsters to justice, making sure that we're preventing it elsewhere wherever we can, but being realistic about what we can and can't do.
Yeah, thank you. Ellie.
The next question comes from Margaret from West Byfleet. Margaret says, I'd like to know why I never see any community police. She says she used to regularly see them in West Byfleet, but hasn't for years. And this links to a comment that we've also just had live from someone who said, all these good intentions depend on resources being available. The police force seems to be lacking in the staff and officers needed to carry out a full visible policing service. Certainly in our area, and this person is from Elmbridge, I believe ASB is on the increase because of this. This does not make residents feel safe.
No, well, I understand that, and I'm very concerned about it when that view is expressed. But if I deal with visibility in the first instance, so obviously the visibility of policing is a natural good. People want to see it. It makes them feel safe, and it does indeed have some deterrent and preventative value. But as the question has stated, we have limited resources, and then I have to decide what it is that I do with those resources in order to achieve the greatest possible value and protection for the public. So we will be thinking about how we can deliver visibility, but in our areas of greatest need. And I can give you an example from my previous force in respect of antisocial behaviour, violence and knife crime, where by sharing data with partners, we came to understand in pretty high resolution those hotspots where we needed the greatest visible policing presence. So I think we can do some work in that respect to think, okay, what areas do we really need to be seen? When do we need to be seen? And for how long? Because I'm sure the public want us to do that efficiently. And I think that will help us then to reduce violence and acquisitive crime, and also critically antisocial behaviour in a way which reduces the need for the police in the longer term. So yes to visibility, but we need to do it efficiently in the area where it brings the greatest dividend. Antisocial behaviour, I worry about, because I think the term is something of a euphemism. It sounds less serious than it is, and actually within antisocial behaviour there are often crimes of criminal damage, of theft, of road traffic offences or harassment, drug taking, and I'm determined that we understand where those offences are and how it is that we can follow up reasonable lines of inquiry wherever possible, and we think creatively with partners about how to address them. I had an excellent meeting early on one of my visits with one of our antisocial behaviour officers, and was really impressed with how she was using the full range of powers to ensure that we're closing down houses where drugs are being dealt and so on. So I think that's something we can do better in that respect. And as for the sufficiency of resources, well, we're lucky, as I'm sure we'll come on to later, to have received considerably more police officers than we've ever had in Surrey. Yep. But at the same time, the mission has got rather more complicated. The investigation of crime is more difficult than it was, it's more complicated than it was, and demands on us are ever greater. However, what we need to do in the police is, rather than think about all those things we can't do, we've got to think about responding really well with what we've got. Because, to be frank, I could be given double the resources and there would still be even more work to do than we could get to. So we've got to focus on being really efficient with what we've got.
And so much of that, of course, is about us working with partners. You've already mentioned mental health, and making sure that the right people are dealing with the right crimes to free up police officers to do what do you call as the job that only police officers can do.
No, I'm so glad you reminded me of that, because the police are, as a matter of common law, obliged to respond when there is a real and immediate risk to someone's life. And of course we'll continue to do that. However, a lot of mental health crises might not necessarily present a real and immediate risk to someone's life, and quite often a crime isn't alleged or disclosed. And where police officers are spending an awful lot of time dealing with people in crisis, it might well be that that officer isn't the best person to deal with that. They're not trained to deal with that. It might be that they're not helping the person as much as they could be helped by another professional. And whilst the officer is looking after that person, they're not responding to domestic abuse, they're not visibly deterring antisocial behaviour, and they're not dealing with knife crime in vulnerable communities. So we do need to really understand with partners how it is that we can ensure that the right person is giving the right care to the person who's most in need. And that can't always be the service of last resort, which is very often the police.
Right, and an important message, of course, on what is National Mental Health Week. Ellie, I think we've got time for one more question before we move on.
Brilliant. We've got one that's not directly linked to the sort of priority in the plan, but it does link to staffing, so it's probably a good time to bring it in. And I actually think it's someone internal. So someone that's recently gone through the PCSO training process has asked, and Tim, this will probably be a good one for you because I know it was a decision you made early on that Surrey Police have now dropped the need to study for a degree for police officer entry. So this person, having gone through the PCSO process, has asked if you plan to also drop the need for the apprenticeship that's currently the way that PCSOs are brought in and trained.
Okay. Thank you. So I should probably take the opportunity to deal with the degree apprenticeship route first of all. So it used to be that everyone joined the police in one very straightforward way. We all joined as police constables, and we all began on the beat, so to speak, wherever we started off in the country. And initial police training classes would have been a mixture of, as is my case, graduates, former bus drivers, career changers, ex-military, and it was a real melting pot of difference, which was tremendous fun and a great way of learning from people's different life experiences. There was, however, a concern that we weren't as open as we might be to people from all parts of the community, and therefore over the years a range of different entry routes have opened up. So we now have direct entry routes for aspiring detectives, for people who want to progress more quickly up the organisation, and so on. And we saw a couple of years ago one crucial change, which meant that people who were joining the police who didn't have a degree were expected, alongside their basic police training, to study for a degree. And there were many good reasons for that. It was an opportunity for a young person to acquire a degree with no debt, with a good basic wage to accompany it. Perhaps they could carry on living at home in the area where they'd been brought up. And we hoped it would be a real agent of social mobility, which would allow young people to join the police, and for the police to give people from local communities a real leg up on the career ladder into a good emerging profession. The challenge, however, is that we are operating in the most competitive recruitment market that any of us can remember. And we found increasingly that a number of people who previously would have been fantastic new recruits, those leaving the military, or perhaps people with young families in their 30s and 40s, were understandably somewhat discouraged from joining the police if it involved a commitment to academic study alongside their training. So whilst that route is still available, now it's the case we've reintroduced that basic route of entry into the police, and alongside it the opportunity, I hope, to be a real competitive employer in the market and see people of all ages and backgrounds coming to join us, because Nev and I are determined that we'll be a force with opportunity for everyone, where everyone feels that they can belong and serve. And we need all different people with different sorts of experience in the police. As for the PCSO apprenticeship, it is subtly different, and it's quite complicated financially. Without going into all the ins and outs of it, it is the case that we benefit somewhat financially from our participation in the levy and the return that we get back on that investment. And I think that with the relatively modest numbers of PCSOs by comparison, it does give an opportunity to give some professional development and recognition in an area where that otherwise hasn't been the case. That said, if we think it's somehow restricting us in the employment market, it's perhaps something we should look at. But I'm afraid we haven't examined it in quite the same detail as we have police officer entry, but you might have another view.
No,
I don't know.
No, that's exactly the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And you know that I am a massive fan of the decision to open the routes up to those who may not want to or not have a degree. I think it's a fantastic thing, and the fact that you did it so early after being coming in was brilliant.
Yeah. But we must credit our partners in Sussex,
Absolutely.
who were very instrumental in that, and the team had long since reached the necessary conclusion. But I was very pleased to support it as soon as I came in.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to move on now to working with Surrey communities so that they feel safe. And again, we're talking about the feeling of safety, because as we know, Surrey is an extraordinarily safe county, as many of you know. 4th safest county in the country, 2nd safest when it comes to homicide. But that feeling of safety is so important to people. And so that's exactly what this priority is about. And it's about working with communities together with our partners and others to make sure that we are getting in there early, particularly for those people who may come into contact with the criminal justice system, and to make sure that we're getting in early and intervening, and as Tim's already talked about, preventing crime. And that can be around, reducing crime more generally, but also, as we've already touched on, antisocial behaviour. And I think Ellie has some questions.
We have quite a few questions on this topic. So the first one from Jill in Elmbridge. So Jill says, Elmbridge Council has adopted a new policy of no longer shutting the gates of parks and cemeteries in a bid to achieve financial savings. Has this led to an increase in antisocial incidents? Maybe one you have to come back to, data-wise.
Yes, so in respect of Elmbridge specifically, I'm afraid I don't know. But it is certainly something we can commit to look at, because in respect of violence against women and girls, for example, we're determined to make sure that public spaces are safe and that people feel safe. I understand the financial implication, however, and I also understand the motivation in respect of ensuring that spaces are as open as possible for people to have the utility and enjoyment of those spaces. But it's certainly something that we can commit to look at in order to understand if it's somehow increased need or demand or any sense of antisocial behaviour, which naturally we wouldn't want. But I'd rather that places were open and accessible, and that we dealt with any antisocial behaviour that was there, rather than that we had to shut down areas of public space.
Yeah. And I think Jill's question raises actually a wider and interesting point around how Surrey Police works with partner agencies, particularly
Yes.
in a time of, as we know, sort of financial pressure and where there is that need to achieve savings. And it's something that gets raised an awful lot with my office, the constituents and residents who come to me, and that's, you know, whether it's decisions around street lighting, of course, and who has the decision to leave the lights on, dealing with unauthorised encampments, we know is one that comes up, and again, particularly at this time of year, we're going to start seeing that again, mental health demand, which you've already touched on, and other issues where, of course, police powers overlap with that of particularly local authorities and county councils and other agencies. Individually, these can be really complex issues, and we know that. I mean, a traveller encampment or an unauthorised encampment can in itself be an incredibly complex issue. But do you have any general views about how Surrey Police can best work with partners so that we can address the particular challenges, but also manage public expectations in terms of what policing can and can't do and how we work closely?
Yes, and perhaps I might use violence as a vehicle for this answer. I think there's real potential in Surrey for us to make better use of our data and how it is that is shared, because whether across education, health, local authority or police, we will, I don't doubt, be dealing with many of the same people and places who need our help. And if one looks at violence in particular, we know that can be predicted with reference to a number of factors, whether it's exposure to drug misuse, alcohol, violence, family breakdown, school exclusion. And I think that by pooling our data, we'll be able better to understand people who are at risk of violence or are likely to become violent, and then ensuring that whether through our commissioning services or the work that we're doing in partnership with other agencies, we can really focus our attention on people who have the greatest need or present the greatest risk. That seems to be a way that we can work more efficiently than is currently the case, I think, and it's an area where we can definitely learn from other forces. They call it the public health approach to tackling violence, and it's about understanding those things which tend to lead to violence in the first place, and with it the attendant demand on health and policing services. So I think that's a way we can both make people safer, make them feel safer, and also reduce public expenditure as well.
Excellent, thank you. Ellie, I think you've got some questions.
We've got lots of questions. The next one is in from Chris. I'm not sure where Chris is from, but Chris says, is there anything being done to try and reduce the littering of byways and fly tipping? There's a fly tip at our location virtually every week. I clear the lanes of small stuff and have done for the last 20 years, but it seems to be getting worse.
So I confess this isn't an area I've yet looked at. There will of course be responsibilities here for agencies other than the police, notably in respect of the council and highways. I'm not sure if there's any particular examples that you can help us out with, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, fly tipping is an area that local authorities lead on, and in fact they have covert cameras as well as officers who deal specifically with that. And we have had days of action with them. In fact, I've been out on one of them where we've stopped any vehicles that are carrying any rubbish. We've checked their licences and so on. Because we do realise how it really can bring an area down, and it's beyond the ability of local residents to clear up that sort of mess. And it's really nice to hear that this gentleman is doing that. All I'd say is that whilst the council lead on it, if we're made aware of it, we do have good links with all of the local authorities in Surrey, and we'll make sure that they are aware of it, and if it becomes a particular problem, a persistent problem, we will support the council in tackling that.
Brilliant, thank you. The next one is from Angela. Again, I'm not sure where Angela is from, but her question is, what will the new Chief Constable of Surrey Police be doing to tackle antisocial behaviour, as it's an ongoing issue for many Surrey residents and is blighting our daily lives?
Thank you. So, as I've already mentioned, the first thing to do is to make sure that we're not lumping what are really serious crimes for people under the heading of antisocial behaviour and failing to deal with those properly. So we've got to make sure that whether it's criminal damage, harassment or other similar crime types, that where there are reasonable lines of inquiry, we're following those up and that we're doing everything we possibly can to bring the criminal to justice. We need to make absolutely clear that they are criminals in that respect. I'm very eager that we do something in respect of open space drug dealing, which again is often dismissed as antisocial behaviour, where plainly it's far more serious than that implies. So there is a lot that we can do in that respect in tackling county drug lines, for example, which is where organised crime groups from cities out with Surrey corrupt vulnerable young people to deal drugs in the area. And I visited our Centurion team the other day, who were doing some tremendous work in trying to stop the supply and the dealing of drugs in Surrey on that basis, which would otherwise cause antisocial behaviour. So that's a really important area that we can focus on. I'm giving some thought to how it is that I will better understand our performance in this area, but I would really like to know our top generators of antisocial behaviour across Surrey and properly track how it is that we can tackle and improve those, in order that at meetings such as this I can explain very clearly what it is that we've done about them and be held to account. And then the work that our antisocial behaviour officers do with partners is really important in this area, and Surrey has a formidable track record for problem solving. And problem solving means that we don't just take enforcement action against the perpetrator, but we understand what is it that's given rise to this problem in the first place. Is there something in the family background in the individual? Is there something about the nature of the area where we could somehow better design out the crime? Is there a way in which we could work better with local authorities to ensure there's youth provision which gives the young person and young people something rather more productive to do than to make a nuisance of themselves? So I think it's about understanding the proper, it's about properly pursuing the criminals for those offences where there's lines of inquiry. It's about thinking how we solve the problems which are giving rise to those things in the first place. And then it's also about making sure that we take a really hard-edged approach in respect of organised criminals who might otherwise make a nuisance of themselves in Surrey and make life a misery for residents.
Yeah, and that's really important. And it's great to see there's an awful lot of national work going on as well at the moment around antisocial behaviour, including legislation soon to be introduced. A lot of the people that contact me about ASB contact about NOS canisters. There's little silver canisters that you may have seen around, which I know are a littering problem, and it's great to see that we'll be seeing some legislation coming forward on that. So that's really, really good. Ellie, have you got another question?
We've got a few more questions. John from Red Hill, he hasn't asked a question, but he's raised a specific concern, which you may want to comment on. So John says, we run a community-focused outdoor education business and are increasingly plagued by large groups of antisocial and threatening youths. We cannot continue to run our business if we can't guarantee the safety of our staff, which would result in the loss of a long-running and greatly valued community asset.
I would urge you to ensure that you report it. It may well be the case that you have done already, but I'm desperately anxious that where reports are made and crimes are alleged or disclosed, that our officers take their responsibility for following up reasonable lines of inquiry, providing a good service to the victim and bringing people to justice. It's extremely important to me that whether it's the voluntary sector or businesses, we protect people who are going about their ordinary productive lives, which are absolutely essential for community life in Surrey. So I'm very keen that that's reported, that we do something about it, and I would like to hear about it if we don't.
Great, thank you. Just stepping away for one moment from enforcement, there are a number of services across Surrey that can support anyone dealing with antisocial behaviour, and in particular dealing with the stress and anxiety that it causes. And if you'd like to know more about those services, if you have a look on your search engine and you Google Surrey Victim and Witness Care, it's a service that is supported and funded by my office. You can find support services there. Ellie?
Hugh from Bookham, maybe a very similar answer to him. So Hugh says, in Bookham we have a situation where people are openly smoking and buying weed. The smell is affecting residents, including children who go to local schools. Can you advise what action can be taken so I can advise the residents? So anything in addition to reporting?
Well, this sort of thing is extremely troubling to me, particularly when people are having to change the way they go about their ordinary lives because of the criminal activities of people who are supplying or using drugs. One point I must make in respect of the use of cannabis is that people sometimes imagine that it's somehow a victimless activity. It isn't. The supply of drugs, however recreational, is associated with some really nasty violence in the supply chain of those drugs. So anyone who thinks they're somehow innocently involved in that is very much mistaken, and I'm determined that we we do all we possibly can to tackle those supply chains. We're giving some thought as a senior team as to what our response ought to be in respect of open space drug dealing, because I know it has a particularly harmful effect on community confidence, and the commitment we might give in respect of following up actionable intelligence or lines of inquiry and what we need to do about it. So I think my answer is pretty similar to the one I gave in respect of antisocial behaviour. I don't know if there's anything you can add in respect of examples of what we've done or something more substantive than what we would intend to do, Nev.
Well, I suppose as a more general point on the antisocial behaviour subject is Surrey, we've deliberately maintained and in fact strengthened the size of our safer neighbourhood teams.
Yes.
And we did that at a time where some other forces were taking different decisions, but it was really important that we protected those, and we've actually grown them over the last few years. And that's deliberate, and it's part of the reason why Surrey's the fourth safest county in the country, despite bordering London and having a good road network. And it's one of the reasons why we're recognised for our problem solving and we're graded by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary as outstanding in that area. So what I'd say is we are reliant on the cooperation of the public, and then we will work with partners. But if that information is passed on to us, then we will look to tackle it and reduce it, because as the Chief Constable has said, if it's having an impact on local residents' lives, that's not acceptable, however minor it might seem. And we have good links with local authorities locally. And we also have, it's worth saying a little bit about a central problem-solving team that consists of a number of analysts whose job it is to really break down why there are particular problems in areas. And then we've come up with some really innovative solutions with partners as to how to solve and reduce them. And there are a number of examples of where that's happened, not just moving a problem somewhere else, but it's actually removed it altogether.
Absolutely. Surrey's been impacted, and roads have been particularly impacted by recent environmental protests. Sorry, I was lucky enough to go out last year and see our officers dealing with it. I have to say it was absolutely exemplary in the way in which they did that. And the issue is something that concerns an awful lot of residents. We are expecting to see more of it. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But I think that Ellie's got a specific question as well that's been asked.
We have had one. This was pre-submitted by Simon. So Simon says, I'd like to hear the Chief Constable's views on how he believes the police should deal with increasing amounts of disruptive protests, such as Extinction Rebellion and all similar offshoots. Does he share the view of Greater Manchester Chief Constable that the legal means to speedily remove the protesters already exists, and it is down to police forces to apply these laws speedily to protect the majority?
Yes, I do. And as someone who was outside Surrey Police at the time of the protests to which the Police and Crime Commissioner refers, it struck me that the force understood its powers extremely well and dealt with things appropriately. It is, of course, vital to emphasise that the police are positively obliged to facilitate peaceful protest. That, of course, is right, and that we discharge our legal obligation in that respect. However, it's clear to me that where there is serious disruption, where criminal offences are committed, then the police must similarly take their responsibility to deal with that serious disruption and to deal with those criminal offences. And Surrey has a really good capability in respect of public order with our partners in Sussex Police. It struck me that that was in evidence when the protests last took place, and that a sensible balance was struck. So, as ever in policing, it's a matter of reconciling and balancing our rights, responsibilities and obligations. In this case, our obligation to facilitate, of course, protest, but to remember our obligations in respect of dealing with serious disruption and criminal offences. And I'm very confident that we've got the means to do so, and to do so professionally and impartially without fear or favour.
Right, thank you. Residential burglary is an issue that comes up an awful lot for constituents and and residents, and it's something that people do fear and occasionally sadly experience. And Surrey has put significant resource into dealing with it. We're in a much better place than we were certainly 12 months ago. And that sort of improved 12-month rolling average and the month-to-month data doesn't paint quite such a clear trajectory as the rolling annual average. So August saw a huge spike, as we know, in the outcome rate, which has essentially pushed up the rolling average, of course. With that in mind, are we hopeful that the performance can be maintained?
Thank you. So burglary nationally continues to fall if you look at the overall trend line. And one would expect that to be the case because crime is changing. It is less appealing for criminals to take property and try and dispose of it from houses in a way that it once was. Houses are generally more secure. Doorbell camera footage is more, or doorbell cameras are more widespread, and therefore the footage is more readily available. And Surrey's done some terrific work actually in ensuring that footage is pooled and beamed into investigators in order that they can make use of it. And of course, we've also seen changes in people's working habits. So with the advent of working from home, premises are more likely to be occupied. So all of these things have combined, thankfully, to drive burglary down in the long term. But I'm under no illusion, this is an absolutely awful crime. It's a crime which really frightens families. I've seen cases where people have been too frightened to want to, for the children to go upstairs, or they felt they'd had to move house because they can't get the crime out of their mind. So it's really important that we respond well. And Nev will know much better than I the effort which Surrey has made in the last couple of years or so drastically to improve its investigative response to burglary. And so just because there are fewer of them, it doesn't change the fact that this is a really serious offence. And again, that means a really good initial response, a thorough investigation, making the best use of our intelligence systems, including covert policing, doing all we possibly can to prevent repeat offences, because we know that we see repeat targeting of addresses or multiple offences in some areas over others. That's where the problem solving comes in again. And I'd like people to rest assured it will continue to be an area of focus, precisely because, like violence against women and girls, of the profoundly awful experience it is for the victim. I don't know if there's anything you want to add about particular cases or examples or work, Nev.
Yeah, just add the Commissioner mentioned increase in August of the amount of burglaries we solved, and that's in part because we were really successful at tackling and identifying a group of burglars who were operating in Surrey and a number of other counties, and we led the operation to arrest and charge them with a whole number of offences. They're remanded in custody at the moment, awaiting trial. And for charges of conspiracy to burgle, we were able to link them to over 30 cases, not just in Surrey, but beyond as well. And that's a good example of where we will take the lead on crime groups that are affecting Surrey and residents of Surrey, particularly with things like burglary, which is such an insidious crime. And it's worth saying, you won't find a single police officer or frontline member of staff or those supporting police officers that isn't keen to catch and convict a burglar. It's one of the things that is in our blood and we love to do, because we do recognise the impact it has on people and communities. And whilst we're proud of the prevention record in Surrey, as the Commissioner has said, the number of criminals we're bringing to justice wasn't good enough, and I'm pleased to say is much better now. We're in the top half of forces in the country, and we aim to continue to improve.
Yeah, great. And it really has been the most fantastic turnaround, hasn't it? It really has been great, and I'm very confident that between the leadership of both of you, we can see that continue, so that's great. We're going to move on now to another very important topic, which is strengthening relationship between you, Surrey residents, and Surrey Police, and of course that's what events like this are all about. It's to make sure that you can hear and ask your questions. So I think with that in mind, Ellie's got some questions, I think.
I do. So the first question comes from Ellen. Again, I'm not sure where Ellen is from, but Ellen's question is, why do police not attend calls anymore? I contacted the police about drugs being sold to kids and adults in my area, and a neighbour found a used needle, but no police ever came. It's still going on year after year. We can't even go out in our garden or leave the back door open because of the smell and the voices at night. We never see the police these days.
Well, this is precisely the sort of practice which I want to see reviewed and to understand how we can improve our response. Now, it might be that when someone calls in via 999 or 101 in a particular case, let's say that the offenders aren't present, or there's no immediate reasonable lines of inquiry to follow up. We don't attend immediately. That might be because we're dealing with something which is really critical elsewhere. But it's not to say there shouldn't be a considered response where we follow up lines of inquiry, where we understand, we make good efforts to find out the identities of those involved, where we work with partners to understand what it is about that particular area which is giving rise to the problem, because it really does trouble me to hear that people are living with that sort of behaviour and having to change their lives as a result in the way they shouldn't have to. So, as we've already mentioned, there are always challenges in respect to the amount of work that has to be done and where we put our resources to deal with that work. But it doesn't mean there aren't ways that we can work with our partners and use our full range of powers to deal with that sort of offending.
Yeah. We've had a sort of comment from Neighbourhood Watch, which I think it is absolutely worth addressing. And Neighbourhood Watch across Surrey are brilliant, and I know I work very closely with them, and I know the Force does as well. And Richard raises, and it's a really important one actually, which is that disconnect between what the general public want and need, which we've been talking about, and we've been hearing some of the questions about that, and what policing is actually able to give. This idea that crime levels are ever increasing with more serious crimes involving guns, knives and drugs, and that of course is not true.
No.
I think it's really important that we say that is absolutely not the case. We've seen, I suppose we could call it traditional violent crime, we've actually seen that reduce quite significantly, and certainly in Surrey we're very fortunate. Richard says certain places in the country are unsafe to be in. That's absolutely true. Again, we know that Surrey is, as we keep saying, one of the safest counties, certainly the safest county in the southeast by some distance. But he's absolutely right. These kind of crimes are making headline news on a daily basis, partly because they are unusual, and that's the thing that drives the headlines. He says we need more of a police presence on our streets to act as a visual deterrent and to act as a visual reassurance, which I think is probably around, how do you balance that immediate concern of the community and the ones that they feel, and we've been hearing about some of it, with some of those wider threats that perhaps the public don't see because so much of them are happening to the most vulnerable in society and behind closed doors?
Thank you. So to my earlier point about visibility, police visibility can be a really good way of preventing and deterring crime in the right places. But I have to think about where it is that I deploy my officers to the greatest possible effect and the greatest possible value. And one of the things that we do much more of now, I'm pleased to say, which policing didn't do very well 20 or 30 years ago, is to respond to cases involving vulnerable people, the most vulnerable, the most dangerous behind closed doors. That might be the abuse of a child. It might be the abuse of a partner in a domestic setting. Perhaps an even better example is the work done by our investigators to deal with indecent images of children which are exchanged and distributed online, where they're working tirelessly not only to bring to justice the people who trade in such awful images and therefore themselves pose a risk to the people around them, but also to track and identify the children who are in those images. Now, that type of activity might not be visible to the public, but I imagine most right-minded people would agree it's absolutely essential that the police do it. So it's for me to strike a balance between ensuring that we're available to respond swiftly to people who are in their moment of greatest need, and we've got good response policing, that we've got neighbourhood police teams working in partnership with local authorities to identify what's causing the antisocial behaviour and to use our enforcement powers wherever appropriate and to solve those problems, but also that we've got officers who are working on the organised crime which is giving rise to the misery of drug dealing or the abuse of children or the sexual exploitation of children or the sort of fraudulent behaviour that we've also heard explained about. That generally isn't going to be tackled by high visibility policing. But I assure you that the officers working behind the scenes aren't simply involved in some sort of administration. They really are dealing with some extremely dangerous people and trying to keep the very vulnerable safe from those people.
Yeah, that's incredibly reassuring. Ellie, I think we have time for one more question before we move on.
So, we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but Jeffrey from Cobham, in terms of sort of relationships with police and community, Jeffrey says it's obvious to the residents of Cobham that we're sorely understaffed in the police service. We have one good PC in our area, but we've not had a PCSO for over a year, and therefore we believe we're not being given the service the community expects. What can you do to reassure we will get more resources? We want visible policing.
So I'm glad you mentioned the point about police community support officers. We're delighted that we've managed to recruit so many new police officers in response to the government's targets and extra funding in that area. But we could recruit more police community support officers than is the case. And we do have vacancies for PCSOs, and we know they're absolutely crucial as a means of engaging with the community, of providing visibility, and of dealing with so much of the preventative, reassuring work which is absolutely necessary. So I suppose I should use this as an opportunity for a real call to arms in the recruitment of PCSOs. A lot of those have gone on to be police officers, which is why we're relatively low on them at the moment. But there are vacancies. It's a terrific role for someone of any age or experience to do, and we're really eager to receive applications from people who want to serve as PCSOs, because it's a very rewarding career for people to work among their communities, as has been described in Cobham. So I'm sure that even if we were fully staffed in that respect, we would want more. But with PCSOs, actually, it's as much a question of recruitment as it is having the money to pay for them.
Yes, absolutely right.
Yeah, absolutely. Desperate trying to recruit PCSOs. And as somebody who lived in Cobham for 10 years, it is a very lovely place to live, I have to say, and very, very safe as well. Now, we're going to move on to something. This is the last of the points from the Police and Crime Plan. I know it's one that matters to an awful lot of you as well, and that is ensuring safer Surrey roads. Now, Surrey, as you will all know, anybody who has been out in their car recently or their bike or even walking about, knows that Surrey has some of the busiest roads in the country, and actually one of the busiest roads in Europe with the M25 stretch that runs through. And as somebody who uses it every day, I can assure it is absolutely still very busy. Significant numbers of vehicles, of course, use our roads, not just Surrey residents and businesses, but also those who travel through our county to get to other parts of the country and to London as well. Road safety is therefore obviously very significant and important to our residents, and something that is very important to me in the Police and Crime Plan. And I spent this morning at Epsom College meeting with our road safety team and also Fire and Rescue from Surrey and others about Project Edward, which is a brilliant campaign, runs every year, and it is about having every day without a death, so no death on our roads throughout the project. And of course, this is their intensification week. So a really important topic, and something that I think Ellie has been inundated with questions on. Ellie, so over to you.
We have lots of questions, and also a topic I'm particularly passionate about too, so I'm glad we've got lots of questions. First one from Peter. How will the new Chief Constable fulfil the pledge to improve road safety, with particular focus on the reduction of speeding within residential areas where risks to the general public are higher than, for example, motorways and dual carriageways? And his follow-up is, what role can the public and local residents play in highlighting areas or roads of particular concern?
Thank you. So the last point is of course particularly important, because we rely on information from the public to bring to our attention where there is risk which we need to address. I visited our roads policing team a couple of weeks ago, which is a really capable team focusing on the causes of death and serious injury on our roads. And I think it's important for me to state that a bereavement as a result of a road traffic accident is no less serious than one as a consequence of a crime. So it's every bit as important that we focus on those. I want to really ensure that we're focusing not only on the misuse of drugs, the misuse of alcohol and other things which cause dangerous driving, but also that we are denying criminals the use of our roads, because people who are disposed to criminal behaviour more generally are also less likely to be insured. They're more likely to drive recklessly, and I think that there is a way in which we can use our traffic powers to take criminals off the road, and also thereby disabling them from their criminal activities, but also making our roads safer. So that's an area of particular interest to me. But of course, I would encourage local communities and volunteer groups to get together and identify how it is that we can better target the causes of of danger on our roads. I don't know if you can add anything to that, Nev.
Yeah, just add a little bit to what the Chief Constable said. So in the last year, we have our roads policing team, which work across Surrey and also Sussex, and a key part of their role is to make Surrey's roads safer. And but we've also set up another team called our Vanguard team, and their job is specifically to try and reduce deaths and serious injuries on the roads. And they target what are sometimes referred to as the fatal five. So it's those drivers that are speeding, using a mobile phone, involved in any sort of careless driving. So report that if you identify it, because they're the drivers we want to target. Not wearing a seatbelt and drink and/or drug driving. Those 5 things are the 5 things that team are focused on above anything else, and that is to reduce the number of people injured and killed on Surrey's roads. And some of those things might seem minor in isolation, but there are a quite significant body of evidence now through academic studies that show that those 5 things are the 5 things that are at the highest risk of causing death or serious injury.
We've had a question from David. He says, Chertsey Lane has been the scene of 2 recent traffic fatalities. The posted 40-mile-an-hour speed limit is frequently exceeded and the road is dangerous. Could we please have action to address this? I know it's going to be difficult to answer that live now on a specific road, but could we perhaps take that away and provide David with an
and
answer?
I'm aware that the issue in Chertsey Lane is something we have looked into already, and I'm happy to take that away and report back.
Brilliant. Sticking with the subject of safety, Alan says, I'm a pedestrian, cyclist and car driver, but feel much more vulnerable and at risk when on my bike, with cars passing me far too close for comfort and safety. It would appear that few drivers are aware of the recent changes to the Highway Code aimed at improving the safety of pedestrians and cyclists. I wonder whether it would be possible to mount a low-cost publicity campaign to raise motorists' awareness of the new rules, emphasising the vulnerability of those on 2 wheels compared to those on 4.
I quite agree, and of course we're encouraging more people to cycle, and it's important therefore that we provide for their safety. Now I understand there has already been something of a campaign in respect of this area led by the communications team here. I think it's Close Pass, which goes directly to the concerns which Alan describes, but I'm happy again to take that away as something which we might consider more of in respect of communication.
Yeah, I think so. And the new Highway Code rules came in last year, and as I actually have the National Road Safety Brief for PCCs, and it's something that I've been discussing with DFT in recent weeks about that wider campaign. I think the plan from DFT was to get the new rules in, try to get people a bit familiarised with them, and then over the summer run a much bigger national campaign, which of course I am sure Surrey Police and certainly my office will support. So really, really important, and from my point of view as the roads lead, and I know from your point of view, Tim and Nev, that we make sure that we are protecting all road users, whether they're drivers, motorcyclists, cyclists, pedestrians and horse riders, of course, which we also know we have an awful lot of in Surrey.
We've had a very similar question from Simon on Facebook. So Simon, hopefully that also answered your question, which was about education for drivers to be more considerate. Sticking with cyclists, we've had a few questions about, Tim, whether you might be able to look into current investment in third-party reporting, which might be one you want to take away. Not sure if you've had a chance to look at that one yet. No. And then sort of moving away from the safety aspect, particularly of cars on roads, we've got one from Jessica. What is being done about the huge rise of car thefts in the area? My car was stolen in February this year, and there was a week in February where there were 9 vehicle thefts.
Well, I'm glad this has come up, and Nev might want to come in with some practical examples, because we have seen a resurgence in this type of crime, which rather went into abeyance for a few years. But whilst on the one hand technology made it more difficult for cars to be stolen, we're seeing regrettably ingenious ways which criminals use to steal cars. And I know, Nev, that this emerged a concern some months ago, and you set the force something of a challenge in respect of ensuring that we could respond rather better in this area, and not only in respect of theft of cars, but certainly theft from cars as well, and that we're doing somewhat better in that respect. I don't know if you want to cover it.
Yes, I mean this is something that regrettably there has been an increase in, but we've put a tremendous amount of effort into tackling. We've actually brought more than double the number of criminals to justice for either theft of or theft from cars in the last year, significantly increased the number of arrests we've made, and we've also deployed quite a lot of covert resources in some of the operations. And the two main areas we've been tackling really are theft of vehicles, and we recognise if a vehicle's stolen, one, it doesn't stop there generally, another vehicle will get stolen until that criminal is stopped, but also that vehicle is often used in the commission of other crime or it's driven dangerously, and we've seen some horrific examples of where the stolen vehicle has put innocent members of the public at risk. So we take that absolutely very seriously. It isn't just car theft, but also theft from vehicles, and we've had a spate of theft of catalytic converters. It's not just vehicle theft. We were seeing high numbers of those happening, for example, in NHS car parks. So you'd have NHS staff or people visiting sick relatives coming out. They couldn't drive home at what is already a difficult time or after a long shift. We also saw some violence associated with those. I'm delighted to say that that Surrey led on identifying and arresting one of those groups. They were extremely difficult to catch, and a real challenge for us. And it's an example actually where we tried a lot of overt, high visibility methods, none of which worked. It was a covert operation supported by some help by members of the public who were reporting things to us that allowed us to identify that group, track them and make those arrests and bring them to justice. So it cuts across a number of things we talked about tonight, including the balance of having visible officers against those working behind the scenes, but also highlights some of the risks around road safety linked to crime.
I've seen a real change in that in the last year, and residents reporting it, and it really is an enormous amount of credit to the police officers in Surrey for dealing with it. But it really is a Surrey police success story, I think, and sort of goes from strength to strength. So that's great. Ellie?
Got one more. Robert, I'm not sure where Robert's from, possibly Guildford. Why are so many electric scooters still being used on every road and footpath? I've nearly been knocked... Sorry, my screen's just flipped. I've nearly been knocked down by one of these recently on a footpath ridden by two burly adults in Guildford. I'm 70 and luckily managed to move away by a split second.
Well, it sounds an awful experience. We did read about this beforehand. Now, our initial research doesn't suggest that the prevalence of this is such that we're in a position to dedicate a large number of resources to the problem. However, it is something I'm prepared to take away and have a look at to consider how it is that we can that we can address it. I'm not sure if it's something which you've come across, Nev.
No.
Okay. Thank you very much. That concludes the police and crime plan parts. I think we're going to use the last 15 minutes to just look at some issues that are brought up with me, relevant issues that I think are brought up an awful lot by residents. In my postbag, I'm sure they're brought up with Surrey Police as well, and officers raise them. So I just want to spend a few moments while we still have it on raising some of these. Now, we've already touched on these in some of our previous questions, but I do think it's worth looking at again. And one of them is the Government Officer Uplift Programme, and in particular the maintenance of those numbers. And we know that as part of the 20,000 national uplift, which the government has just completed, Surrey was actually granted 259 additional officers, but our final count has actually stood at 395. So that's 136 officers above the target that Surrey Police was set by the government, and they've managed to absolutely smash through it. And it brings the number of officers in Surrey Police to 2,325, which is the highest level of police officers that Surrey has ever seen in its history. And that means there are more officers keeping people safe, whether that's out on the streets or, as Tim and Nev have both talked about, those who are particularly vulnerable, who are behind doors and keeping them safe. And I think, Ellie, you've had one specific question on this.
From Kevin. Thank you for your question, Kevin. Kevin asks, is it possible to provide residents with a breakdown of where these officers will be based, which I know is a tricky question. And his follow-up question is, are you able to give us any insight into current attrition rates and what the force are doing to try and retain talented officers, of which we have many?
Thank you. So that's an excellent question. I'm not sure I can do justice via this medium to the distribution of officers. We've had a look at that, but I'm not sure it's going to make an awful lot of sense if I try and go through all of the figures now. What I should say, of course, is that we're absolutely delighted to have these officers, but a number are still in training. So it's difficult to represent exactly where they are, but that will become, in terms of where they're going to be posted, but that will become clearer as we go. I know a lot of work has gone in before I turned up to work out where it is in both our detective and uniform functions that we can best distribute officers to the greatest public good. So, but I'm sure that's something we can commit to provide publicly as things develop and people emerge from their training. I've already said what we're doing in respect of the change of the entry route to policing, which means that officers no longer have to commit to study for a degree, which risked perhaps for certain groups of people, risk being a motivation for there to want to otherwise to leave the police. So that's something which we've done, which I think is really important. We're also doing a lot in respect of officers' health, fitness and well-being. And this isn't just well-being for the sake of it. It's making sure that where officers confront something dreadful, and we have to remember that police officers run to things which most sensible people run from, that they expose themselves to things every day which most people don't see in a lifetime, that we've got the proper support for the young officers, and also that we're doing all we possibly can in respect of the management of the stress that they encounter, of their sleep, of their diet, their exercise and their well-being, to ensure that they feel really well looked after, because it's important that they're taking responsibility to look after themselves, but we're looking after them in order that they can look after the people of Surrey, because it's a tough job. So that's something we're focusing on. On the matter of attrition, Surrey already has arrangements which I'm keen to intensify to ensure that where we get any sense at all of someone being minded to leave, that we're giving them all the support we possibly can in order to see that we try to retain them. We have the strongest possible sense of belonging. But generally, I think things seem to be going pretty well in respect of officers. Coming back to the PCSO point, we also have to bear in mind that half of our operational workforce is police staff. And we really need to continue to encourage people to join us as police community support officers, but also in really heroic positions in our call handling centres, or as call takers, where that term doesn't really do the work justice. That's where we need heroic people to deal with members of the public who are in crisis, and really make sure that we provide a brilliant first response, not to mention the many other areas of operational policing which there are. So Nev, you might be able to explain some of the other measures in respect of retention, which perhaps I haven't done justice to. Forgive me.
Yeah, I mean, to add to the Chief Constable said, we do an exit interview with every officer that leaves, so that we can pick up any reasons, and we're bringing those forward now to make interventions earlier, so that we can try and take action to retain officers if they're thinking of leaving before they actually do. But we have a pretty good record actually of transferees joining Surrey, and I think that's particularly impressive given that we are one of the most expensive areas to live in the country. So when you take those factors into account, actually we're in a fairly good place. And the Chief Constable and I, between us, meet all of the new probationers who join, and I was talking to a group of them a couple of weeks ago, and I was really struck by the number of them that, so they were about 3 or 4 months into their training, and the number of them that said that this was the most supportive organisation they'd ever worked for. It made me very proud, but also very pleased, because what we ask of our people is more than most organisations do. But it was great to know that they felt that support and camaraderie from their colleagues.
That's great to hear, thank you. Moving to an issue briefly that we've already covered in part, but I do think it's worth revisiting it because it is so important. And I think in a forum like this, where residents are asking questions, it's very important to give them the opportunity. And that's around police conduct, vetting, and of course that really important thing about maintaining police confidence. Now we've talked about Sarah Everard, we've talked about Me Too, and that's all very, very important. But we know that there's been an awful lot of media activity around the Metropolitan Police, and of course, we're not a million miles away. My office works very closely with the Professional Standards Department, and we sort of try to keep as far as we can abreast with emerging issues and trends there. We take dip samples as well of cases and try to provide assurance to the public. But I know that Ellie's had a couple of questions on the topic that I do think it is worth just being able to make sure we can reassure our public, reassure residents how hard the force is actually working and your commitment to this.
Yeah, so we've had 3 questions, but all from one person. So Michael has asked, and I'll put them all to you at once and you can answer them as you wish. Michael says, what precautions are in place in Surrey to guard against such abuse? How have these precautions changed and been updated over the last year? And how is data concerning misconduct issues within Surrey Police accessible by residents? And he also says it would be good to hear your thoughts on current transparency arrangements.
Thank you. So I shall try and deal with those as best as I can. Firstly, as Nev was speaking in respect to the last point, I'd neglected to mention, of course, we have a young workforce.
We do.
Because we've got lots of new people who are joining. And often this is represented as somehow a challenge for us or a problem. And perhaps it is in some respects, but it's also a tremendous opportunity to have young people with this public service mindset and to really encourage in them the sorts of good behaviour which we want them to exhibit through what we hope is a 35 or perhaps even 40-year career these days. So I was asked last week on local radio whether cases as awful as those involving Cousins and Carrick could happen in Surrey. And whilst obviously I hope not, we're extremely vigilant and not at all complacent about the risk of such cases here. We're not as big as some metropolitan forces. We don't have the specialist departments that some forces have at quite such scale, where we've seen that sort of offending flourish and be hidden away. But nevertheless, we're extremely vigilant about the risk which might be posed in Surrey. And Nev will be able to explain further about the comprehensive re-vetting which has gone on in respect of all our officers to look again at whether there is anything in their recent history which discloses some sort of area for concern about the officer. We've long had, as a result of change in the regulations, a much more transparent misconduct regime in respect of the most serious police misconduct, which means that misconduct hearings are publicly accessible, publicly reported on, and the protagonists named. I want us to get even better at ensuring that we learn from the outcomes of misconduct proceedings. The abiding lesson of dismissing anyone must be not to recruit someone like that again. So I want us to make sure that we're learning when we dismiss people, analysing the case and making sure that informs our recruitment and selection. We need to look at the sort of things which characterise misconduct and where those characteristics are emerging in an officer's behaviour, have a way of identifying those and intervening supportively in the first instance, but firmly where the officer really has reached a point of no return. And on the subject of misogyny, which we tend to think of simply as the hatred of women, but of course it also involves contemptuous behaviour towards women. Nev and I will make it absolutely clear to our officers that women do not report crime because they somehow wish to find a partner, that women do not join our force because they want somehow to be sexually appraised as a potential partner. They report a crime because they want justice, and they join our police force because they want to serve the public alongside us. And therefore we really do expect men not only not to exhibit misogyny, which seems a pretty low aspiration, but positively to stand up for and promote the rights of women in the organisation. And therefore that means that we work as hard as we possibly can to recruit and retain women in order that they can serve the public and fulfil their potential as police officers and police staff. And that means looking at the many provisions which we need to improve for women in the workplace, whether in respect of maternity provision or particular health needs which might emerge for those as well. So I think it's much more comprehensive if we want to root out misogyny than simply aspiring not to be misogynistic. It's about the way that we treat and support women in the broadest possible sense. On the matter of scrutiny, I'm not yet as familiar as I should be with the arrangements for scrutiny of ethics and standards in Surrey Police. But certainly in Thames Valley Police, we had a robust complaints, ethics and integrity panel with representatives from across the area who could scrutinise our handling of complaints, our handling of conduct, and give a lay view as to whether we were dealing with that properly. So I'll be anxious to see that we've got the same here. We might well have something better. I've not yet been able to look at that. There might be some other things which I've missed out there, Nev, which you want to mention that we're doing.
Just a couple of things probably worth adding, that we have had all of our officers put what you might have heard it called a data wash, but basically their details have been put through a national database. All that information has been received back by the force now, and we are checking that thoroughly. I'm pleased to say the number of returns of any that may relate to one of our officers is lower than the average number of forces. And what we often find is it isn't actually an officer, it's somebody of the same, of a similar name or same name. But we're doing that thoroughly. We've got a chief inspector, in fact, who's overseeing that and nothing else until that's completed. But we're nearly there with that. And Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary have made a number of recommendations following what's happened in the Met, in particular and other areas. And we've completed 90% of those now. And we did them in priority order. So we put a lot of effort in there. And I suppose there's one important thing that I always look for that is a really important indicator in an organisation, and certainly a police force, is how misconduct comes to light. And overwhelmingly, the misconduct that comes to light in Surrey is because a colleague has reported it. And that always gives me some reassurance, albeit I'm disappointed that misconduct may have happened. It's reassuring to know that there are colleagues who stand up, say that's not acceptable, don't tolerate it, and do something about it. And in some of the worst cases that we've seen nationally, that hasn't happened. And I'm pleased to say that happens regularly and in most cases in Surrey.
Great. I'm very conscious of the time, but there is an important one that if I don't address it, I will get, and I suspect you will, shouts from residents, which is the performance of 999 and 101, which I know is uncomfortable. Surrey has previously been one of the best forces at dealing particularly with 999 calls, and I know there is an enormous amount of work going into it because it's so important. Dialing 101 or 999 is often the first and sometimes the only contact that people will have with policing, and I know that it's something the force is trying incredibly hard to work on. So I wonder if you could update residents on that work.
Yeah, so I've mentioned several times the importance of the police getting on and doing what only we can do with the minimum of fuss. And there isn't anything more important in this respect than making sure we pick up the phone to people who are in need. And that from that point onwards, there's a good response and a good investigation which proceeds swiftly. And our performance in respect of 101 and 999, as the Policing and Crime Commissioner says, has lately not been good enough. Now, there are a number of areas in which we are investing an awful lot of time and effort. We've seen the introduction of a new system for handling calls, and I know that it can be somewhat wearisome when we talk about new technology, but it's important that we do all we possibly can to make sure that we make the best of that system, which will in the long term be a much more efficient way of operating. It is an area which relates very closely to the challenges of the employment market that we have in Surrey. It's desperately important that we're able to recruit and retain committed people who are prepared heroically to serve the public, answer the phone and give the very best service to a victim of burglary or someone who is in some other sort of crisis. So we're working really hard to make sure that we've got all of those vacancies filled, and that includes looking at pay and conditions and other similar areas. And also we've recently been looking at how it is that we can redeploy officers who've got experience in that area into our call taking and control rooms to make sure that we're able to deal confidently with the demand that comes in from the public. So the early signs are that things are getting better, but alongside good basic investigation and bringing criminals to justice, it's an absolute critical area of focus for us. And I'm not sure if there's anything I've missed that you might want to add.
Well, just to give a bit of context, really, as the Chief Constable and the Commissioner have said, we have seen a dip in performance, and it is really important because, you know, if we're going to be there when people need us, we need to answer the phone, particularly 999, quickly. So, and our aim is to answer 90% of 999 calls within 10 seconds. It has been 12 seconds, but we've seen an improvement again. And at 101 calls, our performance dipped slightly as well, but it's worth remembering 101 is a non-emergency number and it's 24 hours a day. There aren't many organisations that provide that facility, and it is important we answer those calls too, but of course we prioritise the 999 calls, and we're moving temporarily 30 officers, mainly officers on restricted duties anyway, who aren't able to do frontline duties, often temporarily on restricted duties, into the contact centres to support our colleagues in there to make sure we maintain a good performance during the summer until our recruitment is back to a satisfactory level. And part of the reason we saw some increasing vacancies in a contact centre is because some of our really brilliant call handlers have become police officers, and very good ones at that. So some of the same issues that we highlighted with police community support officers we've seen in the contact centre, but we are seeing an improvement again, and I'm confident that's going to be sustained.
Thank you. It's great to see that turnaround, and I'm sure this is a topic that we will return to at future meetings because I know it's something the public really care about. We're about out of time. Any final comments from you, Chief Constable or Deputy?
No, I don't think so.
Happy with everything?
I think I've said quite enough.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to tune in. The full recording will be available on our website very soon, so if you missed the beginning, please do watch it back, or if you want to share it with any of your friends, family and other Surrey residents, I'm sure they would be delighted to see it too. And if there is any other information that you're looking for or data, please do go to the Surrey Police and Crime Commissioner website, where you can find our fantastic, unique data hub, where you can look up all kinds of stats about crime and what Surrey Police are doing about it in the county. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. On behalf of everybody here, have a great week. Bye.